Piracy conjures up a very specific image: peg legs, eye patches, buried treasure maps, and a skull and crossbones flag snapping in the wind. Almost none of that is accurate, and worse, it flattens a story that's actually far bigger and far older than a few decades in the Caribbean. Piracy is as old as seafaring itself. It's been practiced on the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, and the South China Sea by Bronze Age raiders, Ottoman corsairs, English privateers, and Chinese fleet commanders who controlled more ships than most navies on Earth. This is the entire history of piracy. The earliest recorded piracy predates any of the names we associate with the word today. In the late Bronze Age, around 1200 BC, a mysterious wave of raiders, known to us only as the Sea Peoples, sweeps across the eastern Mediterranean, attacking Egypt, toppling the Hittite Empire, and contributing to one of the great collapses in ancient history. Nobody is entirely sure who the Sea Peoples actually were, whether displaced populations, opportunistic raiders, or some combination of both. But Egyptian records describe them arriving by ship to plunder coastal cities, which makes them some of the earliest pirates on record. Piracy remains a constant nuisance throughout the classical world. Greek city-states complain endlessly about raiders disrupting trade routes across the Aegean, but it's in the twilight of the Roman Republic that piracy becomes a genuine geopolitical crisis. Pirates based along the rocky coast of Cilicia in modern-day southern Turkey grow into a massive organized fleet, numbering in the hundreds of ships, powerful enough to raid Italy itself, and even kidnap Roman nobility for ransom. One of their more famous captives is a young Julius Caesar, taken hostage around 75 BC. According to the story, Caesar mocks his captors for setting too low a ransom, insists they raise it, and then after his release hunts down and crucifies every single one of them, a chilling preview of the ruthlessness that defines his later career. By 67 BC, Cilician piracy has grown so disruptive to Rome's grain supply that the Senate grants the General Pompey an almost unprecedented level of military authority to deal with it once and for all. Pompey divides the entire Mediterranean into zones, sweeps through methodically, and crushes organized piracy in the region in less than 3 months, one of the most efficient counter-piracy campaigns in history. Piracy doesn't vanish entirely, but the disciplined patrols of the Roman navy keep it firmly under control for centuries. A rare period of relative maritime safety that ends along with Roman power itself. When Roman authority in the West collapses, organized sea raiding returns with a vengeance. Vandal fleets plunder the Western Mediterranean, and later Scandinavian raiders push out from the fjords in longships fast and shallow enough to strike coastal towns and river settlements almost anywhere in Europe. A story significant enough that it deserves and gets its own telling elsewhere. But piracy in this period isn't confined to the Vikings. Across the Mediterranean, a new and much longer-running threat is forming along the coast of North Africa. Beginning in the medieval period and stretching well into the 1800s, the Barbary states Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli become bases for corsairs who raid European shipping and coastal towns for plunder and, most lucratively, captives to sell into slavery. Operating with the loose backing of the Ottoman Empire, these corsairs range as far as Iceland and the British Isles, and over the centuries they enslave an estimated 1 million or more Europeans. Some of the most feared Barbary corsairs are themselves converts or opportunists rather than lifelong Muslims, including the famous Barbarossa brothers, Turkish corsairs, who rise to become admirals of the Ottoman navy and turn Algiers into a formidable pirate stronghold allied directly with Constantinople against Spain and the Italian states. While North Africa's corsairs terrorize the Mediterranean, a very different kind of piracy is taking shape further west, one blessed rather than condemned by European monarchs, as Spain begins hauling enormous quantities of silver and gold out of its American colonies. Rival powers like England and France realize they can seriously damage Spanish wealth and enrich themselves without formally declaring war. The solution is the privateer, a private ship captain, granted a legal document called a letter of marque, which authorizes him to attack and plunder enemy shipping on behalf of the crown. It's piracy with government paperwork, and the line between privateer and pirate often comes down to nothing more than whose flag you're currently sailing under. England's Francis Drake becomes the most famous privateer of the age, raiding Spanish treasure ships and colonial ports across the Americas with Queen Elizabeth's private blessing, even as Spain brands him nothing more than a common criminal. Drake circumnavigates the globe, gets knighted by Elizabeth aboard his own ship, and helps cement England's reputation as a genuine naval threat to Spanish dominance. Privateering like this becomes standard practice for European powers for the next 2 centuries, a cheap, deniable way to wage economic warfare at sea. Out of this same environment, the Caribbean develops its own distinct pirate culture. Rough, informal communities of hunters and former sailors, known as buccaneers, settle on islands like Tortuga, living off wild cattle and pigs, and gradually drifting into raiding Spanish shipping. Some, like the Welsh buccaneer Henry Morgan, operate with quasi-official support from English colonial governors, leading massive raids on Spanish cities like Panama that blur the line between piracy, privateering, and outright warfare. These buccaneers loosely organize themselves into a shifting alliance known as the Brethren of the Coast, setting the stage for what's remembered today as the true golden age of piracy. The golden age doesn't happen all at once. It unfolds in overlapping waves, starting with the buccaneering era we've just covered, and shifting in the 1690s toward a new hunting ground entirely, the Indian Ocean. Pirates begin what's known as the Pirate Round, sailing from the Americas around the Cape of Good Hope to prey on richly laden ships belonging to the Mughal Empire and European trading companies. The most successful of these raiders is Henry Avery, who in 1695 captures a Mughal treasure ship carrying an almost unimaginable fortune, then vanishes completely, becoming one of the very few major pirates in history never to be caught. Around the same time, a privateer turned pirate named William Kidd is hired specifically to hunt down men like Avery, but ends up accused of piracy himself, and is eventually hanged in London as a very public warning. But the true peak of piracy, the era most people actually picture when they hear the word, explodes after 1714. The War of the Spanish Succession ends that year, and Europe's navies suddenly discharge tens of thousands of trained sailors and privateers with no legal work and few other skills. Many drift straight into piracy, flooding the Caribbean with an unprecedented number of pirate crews operating largely outside any state's control. Their unofficial capital becomes Nassau in the Bahamas, a lawless pirate haven where captured ships are refitted, loot is sold, and captains recruit new crews almost in the open. This is the world of the pirates whose names still dominate popular culture. Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, builds a fearsome reputation as much through showmanship as violence, reportedly weaving lit fuses into his beard before battle to appear demonic, and commanding a powerful flagship called Queen Anne's Revenge. Bartholomew Roberts, known as Black Bart, becomes arguably the most successful pirate of the entire age, capturing an estimated 400 ships over a relatively short career. Charles Vane terrorizes the Bahamas with a particular reputation for cruelty, and Calico Jack Rackham sails alongside 2 of the most famous female pirates in history, Anne Bonny and Mary Red, both of whom disguise themselves as men and fight by most accounts as fiercely as any man aboard. Pirate ships during this period aren't the chaotic free-for-alls popular culture sometimes suggests. Many operate under a formal set of rules called the ship's articles, agreed to by the entire crew before setting sail, covering everything from the division of plunder to compensation for injuries suffered in battle, an early form of workplace insurance negotiated by outlaws. Captains are frequently elected by the crew and can be removed by vote, making many pirate ships considerably more democratic than the naval and merchant vessels most of these men had previously served on, where floggings and rigid hierarchy were simply the norm. But this golden age burns out almost as quickly as it ignites. European governments, tired of losing shipping and revenue, invest heavily in anti-piracy patrols and offer widespread pardons to any pirate willing to surrender. In 1718, the English privateer turned governor Woodes Rogers sails into Nassau with a royal pardon in one hand and a naval squadron in the other, effectively shutting down the pirates' most important haven. That same year, Blackbeard is cornered and killed off the coast of North Carolina by a Royal Navy lieutenant named Robert Maynard, in a brutal ship-to-ship fight that becomes instant legend. Bartholomew Roberts holds out a few years longer, but is finally killed in battle off the coast of West Africa in 1722, and with his death, most historians consider the Golden Age of piracy effectively over. The reasons the Golden Age collapses go beyond a handful of famous deaths. Spain's treasure fleets, the original prize that drew so many pirates west in the first place, become smaller and better escorted. Naval powers increasingly cooperate rather than tolerate piracy as a useful nuisance against rivals, and laws harden considerably, with piracy trials streamlined and public hangings used deliberately as propaganda to discourage new recruits. Within a decade of Roberts' death, large-scale Caribbean piracy has been reduced to isolated incidents rather than an organized, thriving economy. Piracy, though, is far from finished elsewhere in the world. The Barbary corsairs of North Africa keep operating well into the 19th century, still extracting tribute payments and ransoms from European and even American shipping. The newly independent United States, unwilling to keep paying tribute, fights the First and Second Barbary Wars in the early 1800s, specifically to stop these attacks on American vessels, giving the US Marine Corps its famous reference to the shores of Tripoli. It's only France's conquest of Algiers in 1830 that finally brings centuries of organized Barbary piracy to a definitive close. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the world, piracy reaches a scale that dwarfs anything the Caribbean ever produced. In the early 19th century, off the coast of southern China, a former sex worker named Zheng Yisao, often called Qingxi in English, inherits her husband's pirate confederation after his death and builds it into an almost unbelievable force, commanding a red flag fleet estimated at anywhere from 400 to over 1,800 ships and as many as 70,000 pirates. For years, she effectively controls entire stretches of the South China Sea, extracting protection payments from coastal villages and fighting off attempts by the Qing dynasty and even Portuguese and British naval forces to bring her down. Rather than being defeated in battle, Qingxia eventually negotiates a mass amnesty for herself and her fleet in 1810. Retiring wealthy and remarkably dying peacefully in old age, making her by most measures the most successful pirate in recorded history. As the 19th century progresses, the rise of steam-powered warships and increasingly global naval patrols makes large-scale organized piracy far harder to sustain almost anywhere in the world. Empires with ironclad navies simply have the reach and firepower to hunt down pirate fleets that would once have operated freely for years. By the early 20th century, piracy has shrunk from a major geopolitical force into scattered, localized criminal activity, a shadow of what it had been for the previous 3,000 years. But piracy never actually disappears, and in recent decades it's surged back into global headlines. Beginning in the mid-2000s, the collapse of effective government in Somalia, combined with the destruction of local fishing livelihoods by illegal foreign trawlers, pushes coastal communities toward hijacking commercial vessels for ransom in the Gulf of Aden and the wider Indian Ocean. At its peak around 2011, Somali piracy costs the global shipping industry billions of dollars a year, prompting an unusual level of international naval cooperation, with warships from the United States, European nations, China, and others patrolling the same waters together specifically to counter it. Increased naval patrols, armed security guards aboard merchant vessels, and improving stability on shore eventually drive Somali piracy down sharply by the mid-2010s, though it hasn't vanished completely. Piracy remains an active problem today as well in the Strait of Malacca and the wider waters of Southeast Asia, where dense shipping traffic, economic desperation, and difficult jurisdictional boundaries between nations continue to create opportunities for modern pirate crews, generally armed with speedboats and firearms rather than cutlasses and cannon, but chasing exactly the same prize as their predecessors, other people's cargo. So piracy was never really the story of one golden age in the Caribbean. It's a pattern that reappears again and again, anywhere trade moves faster than the authority meant to protect it, from Bronze Age raiders who helped topple empires, to Cilician fleets bold enough to kidnap a future Roman dictator, to Barbary corsairs enslaving Europeans for centuries, to a small circle of Caribbean captains whose brief chaotic decade produced most of the imagery we still associate with the word pirate today, to a Chinese fleet commander who controlled more ships than many nations, right up to the hijackers still working the shipping lanes of Somalia and Southeast Asia in our own lifetime. The flag, the eye patch, and the buried treasure are mostly legend. The 3,000 years of opportunists chasing wealth on the open water are entirely real.